I'm Meg Baker. I'm the secretary, no, wrong historical society. I'm the, I'm the curator of the Hatfield Historical Museum at the discretion of the board, which I very much appreciate. I would like to welcome you to the third installment of our 2025 speaker series. Tonight, we look back 350 years to the events of 1675 to 1678 and the ongoing process of uncovering the stories of Native people in Hatfield in the colonial era. It is worthy, therefore, to acknowledge the thousands of years of indigenous families who lived here prior, including members of the Pecumtuck, Nipmuc, and Wabanaki nations, as well as others. Members of these nations live throughout the Commonwealth to this day. Sharing the vast history of Hatfield from any point in the past is our mission. I would like to thank the board for their steady support and all of the volunteers who make events like this happen. Also, and importantly, this program is funded in part by a grant from the Hatfield Cultural Council, a federal agency, no, a local agency, which is supported by a Mass Cultural Council, which is a state agency. Federal is a whole other picture. We thank everyone involved for that support, and please, while you are filling out your membership form to join the Hatfield Historical Society, also take a moment to fill out a brief 4-question survey on the table out there, which collects important information which the HCC uses to determine which projects to fund in future years. So we very, very much appreciate your taking part in that. If you can't fill out the form right now, there is a QR code you can scan on your phone to fill it out later. If you have further questions, you can see the lady in the green scarf. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. Anybody else here from the Hatfield Cultural Council? Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you, for being here and for being a part of making this happen. If you enjoy tonight's program, as Bob said, do consider joining the Hatfield Historical Museum. Follow us on Facebook, leave your email at the table so we can alert you to future programs. Our next speaker in this same space will be on June 19th. It's Dr. Marge Bruchak, presenting material of the 19th century Native American medicine practiced by local Indian doctress is what she was called. And that's gonna also be a great program. Tonight, we are very, very pleased to have with us David Brule, the president of the Nolambika Project Incorporated, chairman of the Nehantic Tribal Council, and the coordinator of the National Park Service study of the Falls Fight of May 19th, same week in 1676. He's been deeply involved in the study of local history for at least the past 30 years that I've been around in Western Massachusetts, and I am very, very glad to have him here tonight. Please welcome David Brule.
Meg introduced me, and I really want to thank Meg for having invited me, and thank you for turning out, and I want to thank the Hatfield Historical Society for this. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about a number of things, one being the findings of the National Park Service study of the Falls Fight, the archaeology that's been done. But I want to kind of set the context, so my first couple of slides will be that. So I'll spend a couple of slides setting the context of this war of 1675 technically through 1676. Some of our Nipmuc friends in the central part of the state say, well, the war is still going on, and so there has not been a whole lot of reconciliation yet, but it's happening. The healing is happening, and the reconciliation bit by bit is taking place, but I want to talk to you about that. So my first phase is going to be giving you kind of the context. The second phase will be involving this region between Sokwakik and Peskiomscut. I'll explain where those places are in a bit. And then I think the third phase should be an opportunity to loop back to Hatfield and have a conversation about what went on here. I'm assuming that you know your history. I know what I have heard and read about Hatfield, and it was pretty fascinating. It was a fairly important place here, given that Northfield and Deerfield were abandoned. That meant that Hatfield was the next in line, the northernmost settlement in the valley for a couple of years. So there's a lot to talk about there. So like I said, I'll loop around back to that. So Waukik is the name of modern-day Northfield. It is an Abenaki word meaning the land of the separated people. So essentially, the Sokoki or Sokwaki are a branch of the Abenakis. And the Abenaki, let's say, nation it's Northfield and Sokwaki was the farthest south that the Wabanaki, Abenaki came. So in Vermont, New Hampshire, and all the way north up to I would say the St. Lawrence River Valley, and out to the Atlantic, going down the St. Lawrence River through the Mi'kmaq and Pennacook country. All those peoples are Abenaki or Wabanaki, same difference. But there was a group that came down to and settled in what's now known as Northfield. So I'll get into that a little bit, but that's going to help you situate that in modern times. And the stretch between Northfield and Peskiomskut is where a lot of the action took place during King Philip's War, at least in the western part of the state here. So Peskiomskut is the indigenous name for what's now known as Turner's Falls. Some people have a problem with that because the town was named after the person who perpetrated the massacre, and way back in like 1850 was about when that name of Turner's Falls first came into being, thanks to people like George Sheldon and Alva Crocker, who decided that development at the falls should be called Turner's Falls in honor of the man who led the attack on Native people back in the 1676. So that name, Turner's Falls, really didn't exist until about the 1840s or 1850s. So natives still call it Peskiomskut. Looking at the word Peskiomskut, typically native words are made up of syllables that have meaning in themselves and combined come up with a certain place name. In this case, the P-E-S-K-E stands for thunder. The O-M-P is stones or rocks, as in Mount Sugarloaf. The original name of Mount Sugarloaf was a Weequamps. Weequaw being the end of something, and omps being stones or rocks. So it's where the ridge drops off right at Sugarloaf. So that is Weequaw omps. This is Peska omps Skut. Skut being the locative, the setting, the place name. And you have a variation of Skut in Massachusetts. Sometimes it's S-E-T-T. Other times it's S-K-U-T. English ears heard Scott, so a place like Swampscott on the North Shore, that is a native word meaning good fishing place. Squam and Scut, Scut being the place of good fishing. So you just never know where these words are going to turn up, but very descriptive place names. So anyway, my point of this presentation is to talk about the war in your backyard. As you know, the war started in June of 1675, so 350 years ago this June, in a place called Swansea. So the uprising began along the coast and eventually spread here to the valley in fairly short order, a few months. So I'll talk about that, help to set that tone. And then certainly if you have any questions, you can interrupt me, raise your hand, or whichever. Some of us were used to classroom teaching, and so kids, were always shooting a hand up and having all kinds of questions. And I've been retired for a while, but I kind of enjoy talking like this. So I'm going to get to the next slide. Again, it's setting the scene. So one of the more striking aspects of English colonization is this concept of all of these towns, one after the other, being settled. And so the native people were kind of overwhelmed. You can see Springfield, founded in 1636, Lexington, West Boylston, Lancaster, Longmeadow, etc. Every year there was a new town. Yeah, this is all material that I've garnered over the years. While we're at it, I wanted to start by showing you this book. If you have not seen it or are interested, this is called King Philip's War. It's the history and legacy of America's forgotten conflict by Eric Schultz. So Schultz and Tugias are the two. And I love it because it's pretty much like a field guide to King Philip's War. It is loaded with maps. It tells you where to go, region by region. If you know anything about the Roger Tory Peterson guide series that describes birds with all the field marks, it's kind of like this. It has, this is what happened in Hatfield. You've got a map. It tells you all of what went on here that was recorded, at least by some of the earliest historians. It's a very good book, King Philip's War, and it's going to be really handy this year because certainly commemorations are going to be starting in June. I've gotten a flyer from the coast where they're going to have a symposium in Swansea where it all started on June 20th in 1675. So all year long there's going to be things going on, and we're working on setting up something here in the valley. But right now a lot is getting started on the coast. But my point being that you can see every year, every 2 years, towns were being settled, and the Native Americans were just back on their heels. The important ones for us are, let's see, I have my pointer here somewhere in a pocket. Yep, if this works on the screen, yeah. So you got Hatfield right here, 1661. And then down here, Deerfield, 1673, Northfield, 1673 as well. So there's a whole bunch of towns here, one after the other, that were being founded, like leapfrogging up the valley, and in a lot of cases, towns coming from the Boston, the Massachusetts Bay Area, but more in the valley here, it was more like settlements coming upriver as opposed to coming across. So all of these, this is just a sampling. Of course, there are a lot more settlements. But by the end of this war, 52 towns in New England had been attacked. 25 were pillaged, raided, much like was Hatfield, that very much attacked anyway. Northampton, Springfield, Providence, Rhode Island, Lancaster. I mean, just go through the whole list. A lot of these towns were severely impacted by this war. Some of the towns that we all would be familiar with: Brookfield, Hadley, Hatfield, Springfield, Lancaster, Northampton, Seekonk, Providence, Bridgewater, Marlborough, Taunton, Chelmsford, Northfield, and Deerfield. This war, Tugias calls it the unknown war, and because of the casualties that happened during this war. But I want to at least have you check this out just to see, because if you can picture, like most New Englanders, we know our history about 1620, small group of pilgrims showing up in Plymouth, and people like Massasoit of the Wampanoags helping them through the first couple of winters. And then in 1639, the Puritans showed up in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the Puritans brought missionaries. The missionaries were there to Christianize the natives. The missionaries came up with this bright idea of establishing praying towns in Massachusetts. I don't know if you've heard that term before, some have, but there were about 12 to 13 settlements in central Massachusetts between Natick and the Quabbin area, where missionaries, John Eliot among the others, had this great idea that if all the natives came to these villages and settled there, then it'd be a lot easier to Christianize them than having a wandering, traveling missionary going to all these little encampments. And so a lot of natives joined these praying towns. They became Christians, they learned to speak English, they learned the Bible, they learned a trade, they cut their hair, start wearing pants and shoes and things like that. It turned out rather poorly for them during the war, towards the end of the war, but I can mention that later on. But they did become educated and skilled enough so that the very first Bible printed in North America was printed by one of these praying Indians called James Printer. So he got his education on one of the praying towns, but also worked at Harvard as a printer. So that Bible was printed in Wampanoag, so that when the effort was made to recover the Wampanoag language, they had this New England Bible in Wampanoag language, and so working with professors at MIT, they were able to begin reconstructing their language, which had almost gone extinct. Most of the native speakers had died away by the 1960s, so this is an ongoing project. Yeah.
Could you briefly describe what would be constituted as a town? Was it like a fork with a stockade? And all the inhabitants lived within the stockade?
Mm-hmm.
Did they have houses?
Yeah. Sure. So the profile of a settlement or a town that I know best is Deerfield, because I work as a guide there, so I kind of talk about what happened, and for example, after King Philip's War in 1704, the famous raid there. But essentially, I'll branch off for a second to talk about Deerfield in the 1670s, and it was basically a settlement called Pocumtuck, based on the name for the tribe that lived there, the Pocumtucks. And they got their name from the river, which is Pocumpetuk, meaning a shallow, sandy river. And so the people who lived near that river. So basically, when King Philip's War happened and Deerfield or Pocumtuck was burned to the ground and abandoned, there was a hiatus of about 8 years there until the settlers came back, changed the name to Deerfield, and got smart. They built a stockade. So they built, if you are familiar with Deerfield and the town common where Deerfield Academy's big administration buildings are, there was a stockade built all around that square, and with a well on the inside. And when the wars heated up after 1704, it was another 70 years of war that was going to be happening. And so when there was a danger for raids, the houses outside the stockade were emptied out. Everybody came into the stockade at night and stayed with friends or relatives, or were put up in some of these garrison houses. So that was what happened. And when in 1704 the French and 4 tribes came down from the St. Lawrence and raided Deerfield, the houses outside were burned to the ground. So on the northern side of Deerfield, the houses you see now are not 1704 era. Most of them are in 1750s or so and going forward. So does that answer the question pretty much? So the stockades, natives used stockades as well. The fort, the native Pecumtuck fort near Woolman Hill up in Deerfield, and also the fort that was on Canada Hill in Greenfield, which we now call Wissatinawag, the original name. That was also a fortified village, a native fortified village with a stockade around it. And when Champlain came to the northern part of these areas, he found fortified fortified villages that the natives had. So anyway, you've had a time to look at this. You get the drift. And to your question, this will be available. It's also in this book, or at least I reworked it so it would fit on this particular slide. Another bit of context is this. King Philip's War was the deadliest in American history, based on English and native casualties relative to population. So Tugius and Schultz here said, measured against the European population in New England, the death rate was nearly twice that of the Civil War and more than 7 times that of World War II. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around that, but I think in the article that was in the recorder, it quoted something like 1 in every 10 persons in this region was a victim. And so it was a very bloody war based on the size of the population. So for Native people, estimated 3,000 deaths out of a population of 20,000. Now, we figure that the population of what's now known as New England was probably more like 100,000 to 150,000, but then the epidemics took their toll. You've heard about the various epidemics that swept through the coastal areas especially, so that when the Pilgrims arrived, there was no one left to bury the dead among many of those coastal communities, and so the bones were just on the surface of the earth. So a tremendous amount. People say basically 80% to 85% of the native population expired because of disease. But when Philip's War began, of course, I attribute, first of all, the overwhelming population growth of the English. I mentioned the small community of Plymouth Pilgrims and the Puritans who arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony. There was an English settlement in Hartford and New Haven. So the population from these little enclaves of English went close to about 76,000 English settlers in that one generation. So Massasoit welcomed this band of pilgrims, helped them survive, but by the time his son, Metacommodore Philip, came into power, there were 76,000 English wanting more land. They had huge families, 6, 7 children, and each son was supposed to get a parcel. So before long, the English were very, very land hungry at that point. So it was overwhelming. People like Philip sort of saw the handwriting on the wall and just said, we've got to drive the English back into the sea. So there was a flashpoint, as I mentioned, at Swansea. Essentially, June 20th in 1675, some of Philip's men had entered a farmhouse and were looking for stuff they wanted. Natives possessing things, they didn't have quite the same concept of ownership as we do or the English did. So they were helping themselves. Not a good thing in any culture, but when the farmer and his son came back from the fields and saw what was going on, the son took a flintlock and shot and killed one of the natives, one of Philip's men, and so that was the flashpoint. From that incident, there was a lot of tension anyway, but from that one incident, the conflagration began. So June 1675, and it quickly spread, as I'll show you in a couple of minutes, into the valley here. So, yeah, I'll go on to the next one. Unless you have some questions, we'll keep moving through. Another part of the context is who was involved. So up at the top of my slide, you have the United Colonies of Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island. They were not so united. Massachusetts Bay, of course, being on the coast, was imagining running things straight across to the Connecticut River Valley and beyond, pretty much the way Massachusetts looks now. But the people the governor of Connecticut, he imagined having control of the Connecticut River Valley going up from Hartford and New Haven. Interestingly, if you think about the way the geography of the Northeast is, you just go over the Berkshires and you've got the same long river, the Hudson. So that English governor in charge of the Hudson, he had his designs on getting control of the Connecticut River Valley too. So they were not so united. And that led to a big problem for the natives as to who to deal with. In Rhode Island, Roger Williams had built himself a good reputation as being interested in native people, in the Narragansetts in particular, and so he benefited from some goodwill on the part of the hostiles eventually. So the colonies, united or not, and who were the tribes? The Pokanoket and Pocasset Wampanoag. So that is people in this area, right here. This is the Wampanoag area right around near Taunton and Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Pokanoket was just a small region run by Philip's family. The Pocasset was another band. A lot of these names were given to the natives by the English. They didn't necessarily call themselves that, but the English, in trying to keep everybody straight, needed to have some way of identifying who they were dealing with. The other cultural thing that the English had a hard time was some of these tribal people had women leaders, women sachems. Several are very celebrated and wound up here in the valley. We'll talk about them in a minute, but I can mention Weetamoo was a woman sachem warrior, so she was responsible for several hundred tribal people. Awashanks, another woman, leader from this area. Mashalisk is one of my favorites. She was the woman sachem who inherited the lands right here from Hatfield up through Sunderland, up as far as the falls. And she was the one that when John Pynchon was acquiring land, he had to go through her. And she wasn't going to sell. And she refused to sell to John Pynchon. There was a kind of a shady deal that happened. Pynchon used his influence as chief magistrate in Springfield to get Mashalisk's son in trouble. He was down in Springfield, he got drunk. Some say that Pynchon made sure he got drunk, and of course he got in trouble starting fights and breaking windows and stuff, so Pynchon put him in jail. Turned around to Mashalisk and says, he's going into slavery in the West Indies unless you sign the deed. So that's how it happened. And Mashalisk was, a Pakamtuk sachem, woman sachem, strong woman. And she's the one, I know so many stories, so you have to bear with me. And since I can feel myself saying, David, no, don't. But since I'm on that vein, so Mishalisk owning these hereditary lands from here up to the falls, including Mount Sugarloaf, which, as I told you, was called Wequamps. And so she was being coerced into signing over all of those lands, and her son Wata Wolenskin was in jail down in Springfield, and she didn't want him to get sent to Bermuda or Trinidad or someplace. So she agreed to sign a deed. But the issue with Mount Sugarloaf is there's an ancient native story about that Sugarloaf being a petrified beaver. You might have heard the story. But if you look at it from a certain angle, you see the beaver's head, you see the long body that literally stretches as far as Greenfield up to the falls. And I have an image taken from Google Earth, and it shows that beaver's head and his body that stretches out. And there's an elderly gentleman from Ashfield who was a naval naval photography interpreter, and he, when helping us when Kinder Morgan was around, and he wanted to show us where the glacial Lake Hitchcock was, and where potential burial grounds would be in the path of the pipeline. So anyway, he gave us this image of that he had filled in with Lake Hitchcock, and you can clearly see the long beaver there. So long story short was the beaver in this huge lake was making life very difficult for the Pecumtuck people in Deerfield by raising the water level all the time and flooding the cornfields. And group after group went to the great beaver and basically said, "Oh, beaver, you've got to lower the level of your water, because otherwise my people won't be able to eat. The corn is being flooded," and each time the beaver whacked the surface of the lake, as they do. If you know, that's a signal for danger, but it's also get out of the way. The beavers do that at my dog when I'm down along the river, and there's a beaver there. He whacks the surface to push us away, and then he comes back up to see if we're still there. So it's sort of a danger signal, but it's also a threat. So the beaver was doing that, and long story short, the elders finally had to go up to Northfield, right near Hobo Falls, where these people live, and Hobomock Falls, actually, off Maple Avenue, up that way. Maple Avenue Street. And that's where Hobomock, the giant shapeshifter, lives, and it's still there. And I tell kids in schools, I say, yeah, you can tell that Hobomock's there, because when you walk by his cave, especially in the winter, there's a kind of vapor coming up out of the snow there, and it really smells bad. So talk about hygiene, and he's down there with the snakes and the bugs and everything else. So people from Pecumtuck went to Northfield, to Hobomock, to Sokwaki, to Hobomock's cave, and said, "We really need your help." So he agreed. Sometimes he was a trickster, and sometimes he helped people. So he was a giant. He came down and tried to reason with the beaver. The beaver whacked the surface of the lake once again, saying, no, I'm not gonna, I need to take care of my kids. So Hobomock basically said, okay, well, we're gonna have to settle this the hard way. So he went up into a place called Sunsook, which is the Mohawk Trail area, and he found the grandfather oak and asked permission from the oak to take one of his huge branches to make a club. So Native people always ask permission, and sometimes permission is denied, and so you have to figure that out. Is this plant okay with me doing this, or am I not supposed to do it? Somehow you would get the vibe and you would know. So anyway, the great oak said, fine, you can take one of my big branches. So Hobomock went back, had a massive battle with a giant beaver, and the legend is that he would swing at the beaver and miss, and that would create gap in the lake, and that kind of created the water flow coming from Fort River, made its way into the lake, or whacking it on the other place, and the Pocumtuck, the Deerfield River, flowed in. So, and the beaver, of course, with its giant tail, was flattening the landscape around here. So that's how come it's so flat. And so that finally, Hobomok struck a lucky blow and separated the head from the body of the giant beaver. And that's what you can see when you're standing near Yankee Candle and you look over to the east. You can see the beaver's head and the gap, and then the rest of the body. And so, to get back to Mishalisk, so Mishalisk knew the story, and basically it was about greed, right? Unwillingness to cooperate and collaborate. So basically, when she was forced to sign over Sugarloaf to Pynchon, she had this in mind. So in the deed, it basically, we have a copy of this at the PVMA Museum, and it's in John Sheldon's book there. It basically says, I assign my lands to John Pynchon and all of his descendants forever. And basically, she signed off the burden of greed onto him too. So she kind of got her revenge. And the story is too that the beaver trade quickly diminished because Pynchon wanted more and more skins, and native people had to go farther and farther afield until most of the beaver population in this region was depleted. So that's Mishalisk. That I went off on a limb there, but I'm in trouble. Yeah. So anyway, that's a very rudimentary map of the tribes that were involved here. You can see the Eastern Abenaki, the Western Abenaki, Sokoki, etc. And way up this way where the St. Lawrence is, these are also all the Mi'kmaq and etc. These are all the Wabanaki people, Penobscots, Kennebecs, Pennacook's, the Nipmuc territory here, Pocumtuck, and my little tribe is right there, the Nehantics, and that's where my ancestors came from. Moved up the Connecticut River Valley and settled in Deerfield in the 1800s, after the Civil War.
Could you say a quick word about what ownership meant to Mashalisk as compared to what it meant to John Pynchon?
Yeah, there's Marge Bruchak. You got to ask her. She'll be here soon, and she can be very eloquent about that. But essentially, to not fall into a cliche, but Native people held land as a collective, and used different parts of their homelands in a seasonal way. They would move to where the resources were the most plentiful for that particular time of year, and would rotate around their homelands. The sachem would oftentimes assign a certain family a place to settle if they're in one spot for a while and it was no longer producing what would be the most desirable level for sustenance. So the whole concept is a homeland. And when the English showed up, they were thinking in terms of home lot. So a good example, when I'm guiding at Deerfield, I point out the Wells Thorne house, which is that blue house, the robin's egg blue house on the main street. And that house was an economic unit. It was the farmer and his family felt it was theirs, and they, could collaborate with neighbors when it was needed, but they had everything they needed right there. They had a vegetable garden, they had a well, they had a cider press, they had a barn, and that was basically their home sweet home. So essentially you can think in terms of homelands and home lots. That's the big difference. And I mean, Marge does a wonderful job in explaining that, getting it much more eloquent than myself, but that's the basic concept, so you can keep that in mind. Getting into the action that happened, the very first conflict happened here at what's called the Hopewell Swamp. Now you should be quite familiar with this. Going up the valley, the way I came down past Sugarloaf, driving straight down through the fields and here, and just a little bit further south of here, not much further than between here and Northampton, was where the Norwottuck Fort was. So the Norwottucks were peaceful Indians living on the banks of the Connecticut River, and friendly to the settlers of Northampton and Hadley and Hatfield, but August. So when the flashpoint happened in Swansea in June, and other uprisings were happening on the coast, the Northampton people were starting to get a little nervous, saying, well, maybe we better get the Norwottucks guns just in case something happens or they get some ideas. And so it was huge to envision taking the guns away from native people. The natives had adapted really fast to European technology. So guns were something new. And when they saw how accurate they could be and deadly they could be when they were out hunting, there's no way they were going to give up their gun, because they needed that. They were still using bows and arrows, but that was kind of passé. And so if you could have a flintlock, you'd be in really good shape. So muskets were an important part of most of the men's accoutrements. And not only to take that away, there would be a question of self-defense that was being challenged, but also effective hunting. And so the Norwottuck down here in their fort got wind of it, and they left. They get out ahead of the English. And they went up to this particular area called Hopewell Swamp. You can see it just below Sugarloaf. I was taken there by a local reporter you may know, Gary Sanderson. He used to write for the Greenfield Recorder, and now he writes for the Montague Reporter. But he's a local historian and knows his stuff. And I had asked him, where is this place? Because this area was where they found in probably around the year 2000, in the late 1990s, they found a hunting camp there with material left behind that was carbon dated to 13,500 years ago. So that particular site was an important hunting camp in that swale. If you were paying attention and you were coming by the foot of Sugarloaf to the stoplights, and instead of going over to South Deerfield Center, you kept going straight before you hit the connector to Route 91. Within about 50 feet, if you look to your left, you would see this gully, this swale, which was a migration path for caribou. So the Paleo Indians in the 13,000 years ago hunted caribou in that spot, and some UMass archaeologists found material going back that far, 13,500 years ago. And so I've always found that ironic that the natives, Norwottuck, in 1675 were hiding in the same place that same swale, and the English just marched right up into an ambush. So that was the first bad experience for English in terms of fighting natives, because they were used to, if any of them were soldiers, they were used to a firing line. You'd stand straight forward, 12 people across, or 15, depending, and then another group behind you, and you would wait till you saw the enemy marching towards you the same way, and then you would shoot them. And then the other rank behind you would shoot, and you'd reload, and that kind of thing. Of course, natives didn't fight like that. So the English, expecting that they were going to be able to confront natives in a usual, battlefield way, eventually wound up complaining that the Indians weren't fighting fair. They were, and there's a whole concept called the skulking art of war. They were guerrilla warfare. They're hiding behind trees, and they were making their shots count. Whereas the English matchlock were these heavy, unwieldy guns, and you get a whole bunch of Englishmen shooting at the same time. You're sure to hit something, whereas natives, being skilled hunters with bows and arrows, had learned very quickly how to use a flintlock and to make each shot count. So that was kind of what happened here. There were about 6 people died there. Let's see. Somewhere I have my clipboard. And a couple of men from Hatfield. So at Hopewell Swamp, Richard Fellows and James Levins were 2 men from Deerfield of the 6 who died in that Hopewell Swamp attack. The point being that what natives did, and this usually worked for them in fighting other native tribes, is the elderly, the women and children would go on ahead, and the soldiers would stay behind and hold off the attackers. So that was the concept that was at work at the massacre at Turner's Falls. And Turner somehow figured out that he could attack the elderly, the women, and the children and not have to deal with the native soldiers. So I'll get to that part. That's why the massacre was so, quote-unquote, effective. So that was the initial attack. People came up from Northampton and Hatfield to try to track down the Norwatics and get their guns back, and it didn't work because the natives had held them off, and they made their way up to Deerfield, and the children and the elderly were safe. I'll come back to that only because I want to talk about Bloody Brook in a minute. If we shoot up to Northfield, there's a whole series of events here that was fairly important, again, in the flow of the action in the valley. So if the Hopewell Swamp attack was August 25th, within 2 weeks there was an ambush that occurred up in Northfield. So if you recall, Northfield was settled in 1673. And by 1675, King Philip's War broke out. So a lot of Nipmuc from Massachusetts, their homelands were around Mount Wachusett. So talking about place names. So the S-E-T-T, like Massachusetts, and Scott, Peskiomscut. Wachu is just mountain. So it's the place of the mountain. And if you've ever driven along Route 2 coming from Boston, you can see that mountain from pretty far away. It's a pretty big place. Then when you get up to it, it doesn't look so big, but when you are from far away. And that's a very sacred place for Nipmuc, and still is. So what was going on is that up here in Sokwakik, the settlers became besieged by the Nipmuc. And word reached Northampton and Hatfield that there was a siege up there. And so a man named Richard Beers Captain Beers was put in charge with 36 men going up to rescue the settlers. So he went up, he left from Hadley, and I always picture him going up from Hadley, going through what's now Sunderland, past that great sycamore. I'm sure the sycamore was there in those days. And then going up towards the area where I live, up through the Montague Plains and past Lake Pleasant. And there's an ancient native trail there that leads down to the mouth of the Millers River, and then across, because the river, that was where there was a ford. If you can picture the French King Bridge, well, down below is the entrance, what do I call it, the confluence with the Millers River and the Connecticut River below the French King Bridge. So they went down, crossed the Millers River, went up towards what's now the French King Motel and restaurant, crossed through that land and hitched up with the modern day Route 63 on the way to Northfield. They, on the 3rd, they camped at a place called 4 Mile Brook. And then the next day, they did the same thing as at Hopewell Swamp. Beers and 30 of his men just marched right up the main trail, and there were about 1,000 natives waiting for them and ambushed them. And so that was the ambush, and I guess you could call it a massacre. It was pretty bad. So if you go up Route 63, you can see all kinds of signs there saying Captain Beers Plains, Captain Beers Road, and things like that in that area. There's these white tercentenary signs that describe some one-sided history of the events all over Massachusetts. So anyway, they did not manage to save the settlers. 6 men survived and raced all the way back to Hatfield and Hadley, and Roger Treat. Roger, I don't think it's Roger. I can't think of the first name now, but Major Treat, put it that way, left to go up and to rescue the settlers. Got up there. They were totally freaked out by what they saw, because some of Beers' men had been hung up in trees as warnings and things like that. It's pretty ghastly. And so they didn't have much time to bury the dead up that way, and they headed back. One of the interesting things was that Treat did something that the English were catching on to. They began employing natives, Indians, to be their scouts and to help foresee a potential ambush. And so there were 100 Mohegans and Pequots with the English. So it's interesting to note that in modern day, well, in the Northeast and in what we call New England now, not all the Indians were fighting against the English. Some of them were helping them. So the Mohegans by then were under the leadership of Uncas. You all heard about Uncas. And James Fenimore Cooper wrote a total fiction about who Uncas was. But Uncas is a Mohegan, highly revered by the modern day Mohegans, and of course they have their casino now, and thanks to Uncas, I guess. So, but on the way back, this is what George Sheldon wrote about. Their retreat. Yeah. As they left Northfield and trying to get back to Hadley. So Sheldon writes, We're left to imagine the long cavalcade, a line of strange, black-looking specters threading its way the livelong night through the gloomy woods, and the panic-stricken riders peering fearfully right and left into the thickets, crowding together in terror at the hoot of an owl or the bark of a fox or a wolf, sure that each was a war whoop of a pursuing foe. So they were, I mean, that's history. I mean, you don't find history books written like that anymore. But George Sheldon here, our man here from Deerfield, had quite a knack for dramatic writing. So, it's quite an interesting book that he has here, The History of Deerfield. So that was, again, an example of how the English just had not adapted, although they did employ Mohegans to start helping them fight, which was going to be eventually a turning point in the strategies of the English. You might know already the story of Bloody Brook. But Bloody Brook was the site of another ambush. Again, the English were very careless about what they were doing. Deerfield was abandoned. Pynchon had felt he had a lot of corn left standing in the fields up in North Meadows up in Deerfield, so he wanted to send up an expedition to get that corn. And it was harvested, and on the way back, right opposite Frontier Regional High School, they stopped they laid down their muskets and went off picking wild grapes, and it was really hot that day in September. And there were about 1,000 Nipmuc and Wampanoag waiting for them in an ambush. So that, again, was a question of the English not being wary and not paying attention, and that is still, I mean, I run these advisory board meetings, and sometimes there are descendants from the local settlers, and there are native people, and Bloody Brook is just, what would I say, 350 years later, people still get mad, they're still angry. And so it turned up at the last meeting, Charlie Ochelski was there. I mean, we had to, there was some friction in the air for quite a while, and felt like saying, guys, look, it was 350 years ago. We could probably talk this out or something. But it is a very touchy point because so many English were killed. 60 men were killed. There was one survivor, apparently, according to Sheldon anyway. And that was a Stebbins, John Stebbins. So he is the one who was the ancestor of all the Stebbins around in the area. And there are a lot of them. I went to high school with quite a few of them, and John Stebbins everywhere. So anyway, lots of Stebbins. But anyway, that was, I'm abridging only because it's a really fascinating and interesting story. But again, it's just typical of the tragedy that the English encountered with 60 men. Most of them were from the East Coast, like Essex and Newburyport and Lynn and Watertown, places like that. There were not too many local men. A man stationed here in Hatfield was a man named Captain Mosley, and he was he made his reputation as being incredibly ruthless, very, very cruel, and he had a band of mercenaries. Mostly, he went down to the seaports and gathered up all the pirates and those types that he could and formed them into like a Dirty Dozen bunch, that kind of thing. And so he was here, and he was heading out to Deerfield anyway, and then he heard the gunshots, so he attacked, and they spent 3 or 4 hours fighting that day. For historians, this is always a kind of an interesting side light, is you've seen these kinds of signs. So these were put together for the tercentenary of Massachusetts. I don't think they used 1620 as a date. I think it was 1630. And so by 1930, they were putting these things up all over the place. Their historical accuracy was a little questionable, and they were fairly one-sided, of course. You know, you could find these signs saying, you know, John Wilson was scalped by a red savage here and things like that. So it was kind of the way people were thinking in those days. It's just interesting for us because we were trying to sort out what this council fires thing was all about. The story is that along Route 63, on the east side, there was a huge gathering place where all of these Indians were gathered together. Philip and Anawan and Awashanks and Witamu, two women, Kanonchet, the Narragansett leader, Nekopik, who was eventually killed at the falls, Pesicus, all these names, Sheldon named these people. And so we are trying to say, now what were his sources, just as modern day historians? Where did he find out all these names? And we wanted to know because for our study, we wanted to know who was there and how come. The Narragansetts tell us, well, they were there to, it was very important for local history and King Philip's War history because Native people were coming together, all the leaders of all these tribes were coming together to make a decision about whether to seek peace or to continue the war. So it was that important, at least in the Narragansett Oral history, that these people were there, and the Wampanoags and the Nipmuc allies and the Narragansetts were all trying to sort out what to do. And we wanted to know where that site was so we could send the archaeologists there. And the mystery is that we couldn't find out where this guy got his information, where Sheldon got his information. We did find out that Samuel Eliot Morrison, a Massachusetts historian, was the editor of all these signs. And the rumor was he had his records bequeathed them to Harvard. So people went to Harvard, and Harvard said, no, we don't have them anymore. His great-great-niece took them to her home. So we somehow got in touch with her, and she said, no, I don't have them anymore. They're back at Harvard. So we never did. And we kind of think that probably he didn't do much research. He just gave his name to it. And all of these, he had other people. So the latest twist is that we have to go to the Worcester Historical Museum there because they might have them there. Because we just want to know, where did this information come from? But that's the kind of problem, you know, this is 300 plus years later. So that's why I put this up there. So when you see these signs, you might look a little bit with skepticism at what they say about what really happened. One of my favorite stories, and I'll keep it short because she tells a fantastic story. This is the route from the saga of Mary Rowlandson. So I'd recommend looking into that if you're interested. And a local author, Lisa Brooks, wrote a book about, called Our Beloved Kin, about the, one of the chapters is about Mary Rowlandson. In a nutshell, Lancaster, I always have a hard time finding it. There it is, right near number 1. So she was captured in Lancaster and taken as a hostage eventually by Witamu, the woman sachem. And she went all the way up to Brattleboro and in this area in Squawkig, and then she was redeemed, ransomed back 3 months later, which is a really short captivity. But she wrote a journal, she wrote a book about her captivity. And it is a really fascinating read because she is, you know, a a Christian white woman writing about what it was like being in a native camp for 3 months. And so Witamu, the woman sachem, was in charge of her. And so they followed this route up to Petersham, up to Athol and Orange, up to Northfield, up further up to Wantastagok, which is Brattleboro, meaning the place where something is lost. But anyway, and then some people feel, Lisa Brooks Marge Bruchek feels that she made it down to Deerfield, but we can't be sure. Nitchawag back to Petersham, and eventually went to the foothills of Mount Wachusett, where she was redeemed. But her book is fascinating, and Lisa Brooks' recounting is because it's a gender studies type of comparison. So here is Witamu, a powerful native woman in charge of several hundred families. And here is Mary Rowlandson, essentially the property of her husband, who feels far superior to this powerful woman, and just spends her time saying how unchristian she was and how vain she was because she's had all of this wampum over her and beads and powder on her face and things like that. And yet, Mary Rowlandson was now a servant, basically. And so the roles were totally switched, where Mary Rowlandson, was now, let's say, under control of this woman that she felt was a savage. I have a little quote towards the end of what she said, but I can't. Anyway, it's a very telling. Lisa Brooks says in her Beloved Kin, the Wampanoag sunk squaw, meaning sunk being the chief, squaw being woman, sunk squaw. The word squaw is not very highly regarded anymore. People don't, because it became so derogatory. But the modern day woman chieftain of the Nipmucs is called a sunk squaw. So used in the right context is totally acceptable, but to say that squaw over there would be really very, very insulting. But she says the Wampanoag sunk squaw and the English mistress read each other through culturally specific frameworks. It was a real role reversal. The native woman became the household mistress in charge, and the English mistress became her servant. So just that one chapter that in Our Beloved Kin was just fascinating. So this is an image from Lisa Brooks' book. What we have here is the next phase that I want to share with you. And I hope I'm not trying your patience. Everybody okay so far, so good? So this is what got me involved in the deep history of the Falls. I was born in Turner's Falls, and we never knew any of this. Nothing was taught in schools, even the local history. Charlie is trying to get the teachers in social studies in Turner's Falls High School now to have this integrated into the curriculum and the information. It's just, kids don't know. They don't know about this, that what happened at the Falls. So I always phrase it as what really happened at the Falls, with really in italics, because everything that was written by white antiquarian historians who talked about this incredible victory at the Falls fight. So what occurred was that the town of Montague, with a lot of prodding from me, applied for a grant to study the event at Wissatinawag, Peskiomskut, the massacre that happened on May 19th. And it turns out that the Park Service has a program called the American Battlefield Protection Program. So we applied for that. They were a little skeptical because the American Battlefield Protection Program was usually, let's say, dedicated to archaeology on Revolutionary War battlefields or Civil War battlefields, and this was going to be a Native American colonial battlefield. And so it took some persuading. Our town administrator went to Washington to be part of the orientation, and he convinced them that, yeah, that this was going to be worthwhile. So it turns out that we landed this in 2012, and we've been meeting ever since, once a month, at the town hall in Montague. And what I really felt was a good step in the right direction was that in order to run this study, we got money to hire an archaeologist, who was Kevin McBride, very well known. But my idea was that we should have an oversight board, somebody to keep an eye on what the archaeologists were doing. And so what we did, I wrote to all of the Massachusetts tribes plus the Mohegans and the Narragansetts to get them to send a representative to our meetings. So it turned out that we have, ever since 2012, we have a Nipmuc and an Abenaki person, we have a Narragansett and a Wampanoag, and for a while we had a Stockbridge Munsee Mohican, and all at the same table with 5 historical commissioners from the towns where all this action took place. That is, historical commissioners from Deerfield and Gill and Greenfield, Northfield, and Montague. So we meet at a table with give or take 3 to 4 commissioners and give or take 2 to 3, these days, 2 to 3 tribal historic preservation officers, and we talk together about what the archaeologists are doing and what they found. And so we have a really balanced cultural interpretation of the archaeology. The natives send people out in the field with the non-tribal archaeologists, and they interpret basically the information that they're finding. And so that's, I mean, that was huge. Back in 2012 and 2014, the Wampanoag Tribal Historic Preservation Office said basically this is unheard of. This is an incredibly successful experiment and let's say collaboration between a town and the tribes to figure out what happened way back then. And we were talking about healing, and my feeling has always been that there are still very deeply held feelings, mostly among the tribal people. Most of the non-tribal people who are in this area don't know the story very well. So what I didn't want to do was to say, okay, we're going to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're all going to learn how to get along. And instead, it became very just under the surface, because here are all these tribal people who had never sat down at a table with white people, and all of these white people, commissioners, who had never seen a real Indian, quote unquote, literally, they admitted it, and all of a sudden they're looking at each other across the table and hearing what the other person has to say. So it was really, and we weren't like saying, okay, well, this is what happened and it's your fault. It was more like, oh, look at what the archaeologist has found. What do you think that's all about? And so tribal people would say, and local historians would say, and then, you know, before long they were talking to each other and meeting out in the field, which is really good. So that's been going on for 12 years, and so it's been incredibly important. One of the first meetings, a wonderful young man named David Tallpine came to the meeting, and he just said, "No, I'm just so grateful to be able to sit at the table with you." And I'm saying, "What are you talking? You know, we are so grateful that you are here." But that was the attitude, because they had never been asked, not in 2012. Now it's not that rare, because I think a part of the Black Lives Matter issue brought a lot of people together. But anyway, we've been meeting, and aside from a couple of squabbles over Bloody Brook once in a while, I'm going to not talk about Bloody Brook at the meetings anymore, because it's still a sore point. But anyway, so this whole thing.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Are you recording your findings of these meetings? I mean, they sound fascinating. No.
Yeah. Meg says it's being recorded.
This meeting is being recorded.
No, those.
That meeting is, you can show up, you can come to them as a
Yeah,
public
yeah.
participant,
But I
but
mean,
they're not.
over 12 years.
Yeah.
Is there a record?
Well, we have an oral historian right here in the front row who is recording this now, but he also comes to our meetings and records them. And all of the meetings for the last 4 years, anyway, are available. It's, you know, meetings are meetings. I mean, it's not always really a lot of fun, but at the same time, a tremendous amount of information comes out. This is, as it says, the battle geography. So if you know anything about Route 2, coming from Boston, from the French King Bridge, you go past this area. This is Barton Cove. This is where the stoplights are at before crossing the bridge into Turner's Falls. And then over this way is Stop and Shop, the Greenfield swimming pool, places like that. So essentially, I have to give you the nutshell version, because like you can tell, there's so much information. But what occurred was in the spring of 1676, both sides had just been beating themselves silly. The English were suffering, and the natives were starving. And so the natives who had left the coast, the Wampanoag and Narragansett, moved up to Mount Wachusett to join their Nipmuc cousins. And from there, they went up to Northfield. And they spent a miserable winter there in December, January, February of 1676. And then they were waiting for springtime, when the migratory fish would be coming up to the falls, at Turner's Falls or at Peskiomscut. And so when April came along, they moved down from Brattleboro to these traditional 10,000, 12,000-year-old fishing sites and campsites. So they were settled here, what's now known as Riverside. And in the meantime, 2 captives escaped, English captives escaped and came down to Hatfield and told Captain Turner what they saw at the fishing camp. And that was, it would be a piece of cake to get up there and raid them right now, because they're not paying attention. They're being pretty sure. This is not true, but that's what the young English boys said. And so Captain Turner, who was stationed in Northampton, recruited dozens of men from Northampton and Hatfield, Hadley, and he had about 60 garrison, that's too many, 20 garrison soldiers with him. And they decided that because Hatfield had just been raided, and the Indians up here from Peskiomscut had come down and taken off about 70 cattle from the meadows up here, just north of town. And so that created, by then that was the last straw. The young men of Hatfield were outraged, and so they wanted revenge. So they talked Turner into undertaking a raid. And so Turner had these garrison soldiers and a lot of the farm boys from here, and they decided they were going to head up to take advantage of what the two captives who escaped said, that it was going to be really easy to disrupt that camp. So they went up through Deerfield, which by then was burned to the ground. There was nothing there. They crossed over at Cheapside and followed the Green River up to basically where the Greenfield swimming pool is and Route 91 goes now. Then they followed, they crossed the river and followed the Cherry Rum Brook that eventually leads to White Ash Swamp, which is right where Stop and Shop is on the extension of High Street. And Lodge Tire is right over there. And then they got to this part, Factory Hollow, left their horses at the top of the hill, came down and hung out up in this area, waited for dawn, and then they swept down on this camp. And that was where the elderly and the women and children were stationed. The native soldiers were here at Unity Park, Fish Ladder right over here. They were, excuse me, whoops, I'm way off, up here. Yeah. They were on these islands, on Smead Island. They were on the top of Canada Hill, Wissatinawag, upriver at the Millers River. And so anyway, Turner managed to slalom his way through, get up here, come down, and attack the people at Peskiomscut. They say about 250 to 300 people were killed, elderly, women and children. After a while, they wanted to save their powder, so they just were killing people with their swords. And a lot of people were fleeing and jumping into the river. In those days, of course, there's no dam there, but just a massive waterfall that could be heard all the way down to Deerfield, for that matter, because there's such a roar. That's where the Thunder Rocks thing comes from, the Peskiomscut comes from. So a lot of people were swept over the falls and drowned down below there. And they lingered too long. Young Jonathan Wells from Hatfield, 16 at the time, nobody had been north of Deerfield in their lives, except they had two guides, Benjamin Waite, and I forget the name of the other person, but that Waite name is still around. And so there were two guides. They knew where to go, but everybody else never came up as far as the falls. So they heard that there was going to be a counterattack, and then Philip with 1,000 men was coming. So they freaked out and lingered too long, getting souvenirs and pillaging and stuff, and gave time for a counterattack. And the soldiers from this part of the bank, the islands, the Wissatinawag, Cheapside, everybody converged at the sound of the gunshots. And the English panicked. They got back to their horses and started, since they didn't know where they were, they just went back exactly the way they came. So they followed the same route, and the Indians knew that. And so they hung out and waited at various good ambush spots, just cut across country. A famous example is right here. This is approximately where Country Club Road is in Greenfield, near Terrazza restaurant and out that way at the golf course. And so the English are following this stream, and they were attacked right here. We found musket balls from that attack. And then the English following the stream went down this way, came back up, and of course the Indians just crossed over the little meander and just waited for them to show up again. And then again, there was another ambush there. And all this way, there were 38 English who never made it out of the swamp alive. They were killed. So a lot of the 150 men, there were about 40 to 45 who died that day or within a few days or weeks due to mostly PTSD, I think. Hope Atherton, who was the pastor, the preacher in Hadley, he escaped because the Indians didn't know what to make of him. There was this tall, brooding man who was wandering, trying to surrender to them. They didn't want anything to do with him. But he made it back, but he didn't. He committed suicide within a year. It was too much. And Turner was killed. Captain Holyoke died of alcoholism within a year. So it was very tragic. I think it was even in those days, given the level of cruelty that happened in warfare, it was really too much for a lot of these people. They fled. They came down this way, and I'll show you a couple of slides in a minute of what happened at the falls. But all of this has been what we've been working on for 10, 12 years, trailing this. The whole point was the American Battlefield Protection Program was interested in the battle, not necessarily in artifacts other than battle-related. So the archaeologists were using metal detectors, and they started up here, right about where Wagon Wheel Restaurant is now on Route 2, and then they went up following the musket ball trail because the natives had superior arms. They were given the state-of-the-art flintlocks by the Dutch and the French. And the English, as I said, these are a couple of soldiers who had sort of, guns that they could use, but most of the boys from Hatfield and Hadley, they just had hunting rifles, and they were not trained. The native soldiers, of course, were, from being young boys up until men, they were taught all the various military art of fighting war and how to avoid being killed. And so they were highly skilled, and they were all over New England fighting in all of these battles and picking up guns from the battlefield. So these were hardened soldiers, native soldiers, and the boys from Hatfield and Hadley were just not a match for them. So the casualties are pretty high. This is a summary of what, in 2020, what the final report was, and it looks like this. This is the book. This is the third one that they have put together. It's called a kind of a technical report. There will be one coming out from this past archaeological field work study. It has not been published yet, but it'll probably come out in the summer of 2025. So a ton of information there. This says 3 miles of the 6 mile long battle, and in fact they finished the last 3. So it is now done. They've covered the entire route from Peskeomscut Wagon Wheel Restaurant all the way to the Deerfield River Ford. Yep.
Do you try to go back and collect the names of the men that went up there by going into the town?
The names of
the soldiers.
Well, what? Are you familiar with George Sheldon's book? Okay, because he's got the entire list here. It's a fascinating book. Sheldon, considering he wrote this in the 1880s, before Google and before automobiles or stuff, he went to unbelievable detail. He's got letters that people are writing back and forth to each other and all kinds of stuff. But he has a list of all the names of the people who were and what their status was. Did they survive? Did they die? Were they wounded? So it's incredible. I was looking through it for Hatfield names just before yesterday, before coming here. It's all there. So they've done 7 miles of the battlefield, which made it kind of complicated given the battlefield is that long. Usually you have like the Battle of Little Bighorn, I mean, it's a circumscribed area, whereas this covers a whole lot of terrain. The people who escaped, the boys who escaped and got back down here to tell Turner what was going on, said, well, there was an Indian camp, but there were more than just that one camp. There was a camp on Canada Hill. There's one in Unity Park, Cheapside, the islands, and Deerfield Meadows, and up the river up to Miller's Falls. So the Miller's River. So there were a lot of sites that we explored, that the archaeologists checked out. One of the members of the team is a military terrain analyst. So he was able to do something that the earlier historians in 1680, 1690 couldn't do, which was to visit the site and analyze how the natives could have used the terrain to their advantage. So he identified various gaps. There was terraces, swales. That was really interesting because in Fall River, high banks, but there were passages where other streams had created a sort of a valley, and so that's where the English went up. Knowing that, they were metal detecting in those swales and finding all kinds of musket balls lodged in that particular trail as the English were trying to flee. So with their their metal detectors, they're following here. They run out of musket balls to the left, and they know that this is probably where they were. They go to the right, no more musket balls. So they're able to trace the escape route all the way 7 miles. So that was pretty fascinating. In 2020, they found 548 lead musket balls embedded in the banks and etc. Now we're up to about 1,010. So it's that will be the latest report. We pushed them hard to both the tribal people and the archaeologists to say, okay, what were the strategies that the natives had? Philip, first example. So the war has his name, but he was not a fighter. Nobody ever saw him on the battlefield. He was a diplomat, and he was in charge of logistics, and he was out, dealing with the French and the Dutch and getting munitions and things like that, but he was not a warrior. On the other hand, these men, whose name is never mentioned, these were the warriors. Matunas was a skilled Nipmuc general. Shoshanim was an Abenaki. Kanonchit was a Narragansett. He was the principal leader just after Philip. Philip was the logistician, and Kanonchit was in there fighting the war. Quayapin was a woman leader. Matomp was a Nipmuc. Witamu was another woman leader. Monoko, Tuspaquin, these are all people whose names are not known in our history books, but I make it a point, especially on the Day of Remembrance coming up on Saturday, that I always say their names because they really should be known. Right along with William Turner, I guess, and Benjamin Church and Miles Standish and all those names that people know. But these were people, patriots defending their homelands, figure that. These were invaders. The English were coming into their homelands and destroying their villages and threatening their families, and these people were defending themselves, and they were defending and they're fighting for their families. So these are people who at least should be remembered. There's a coalition, an international group of fighters. There are mixed tribal people fighting under one particular leader, but there was another group that was following, say, a Narragansett or a Wampanoag or a Nipmuc or a Pecumtuck. So they were really cooperating. superior knowledge. So they had been living and fighting there for 10,000 years. So they knew the area so well. And the English were, like I said, the boys from Hatfield. They didn't know where they were. If they got north of Deerfield, they were lost. And so the natives, who had a lifetime of training and knew every nook and cranny and every rock and hill. The other fascinating thing that I'll close with is Stephen Williams' notebooks. If you grew up around here, there's no way that you grew up without reading The Boy Captive of Old Deerfield. And that was the account about Stephen when he was captured in 1704. So he was captured, taken up to Canada, and learned several Indian languages, and was eventually redeemed, came back to Deerfield, and he wound up being a pastor in Longmeadow. And so when he was a middle-aged guy, he decided that he was going to find some of the veterans of 1676 and interview them, which was really great. So he had a notebook. He did all of these interviews, and then it dropped from sight. And then about 7 years ago, it came up for auction. It just surfaced, and Deerfield, the PVMA, Comtech Valley Memorial Association, went bonkers. They went to find out where it was. They confirmed that it was the real deal, and they bought it. They bought it at sale, and then brought it back, and it's in the PVMA library now. And then Peter Thomas from South Deerfield, an eminent historian. I mean, he's really a major scholar from this area, born in Deerfield. And he transcribed it for everybody. In other words, Stephen Williams was writing by hand in this very flowery, misspelled English. And so Peter, sat down, and, an academic as he is, and he just wrote it all out in modern day English so we could understand what that was all about. But he interviewed these veterans of the Falls fight, and he found some native people also who had been there. So it's an incredibly valuable, basically first-hand account of what happened. So that was a huge breakthrough for the archaeologists to get a look at that. I want to just show you in closing, check this out. So this was last year, 2024. The archaeologists found there was heavy fighting at the Greenfield swimming pool. So if you can picture the Greenfield swimming pool, there is the side where there's a beach, and on the other side there's a high hill. And on that hill is where the natives were installed, shooting down at the English who were trying to get across Green River somehow. So the natives knew they were going to try to cross because they came up that way. They want to go back that way. And so they literally found musket balls in that hill and at the foot of the swimming pool that were there from that day. And so that was really huge. And basically what the English were trying to do is right at the Greenfield swimming pool, they were trying to get across the Green River to get back towards Deerfield. And what occurred was the natives knew that, so at every point they were there stationed to prevent them from doing that. So they kept going. They kept going out past the Greenfield swimming pool and then angled down past Four Rivers Charter School and GCC, heading towards the Rotary, where you can picture where what is that place? Friendly's Ice Cream, and right in that spot there, we can catch Route 91 to go south, and going through there, and then they tracked the musket balls. They found musket balls all the way. Captain Turner was killed at the ford where the natives prevented the English from crossing. So that was a fascinating find because the story is that Turner was killed and buried on one of the terraces near where, just above Greenfield Swimming Pool on the way to Greenfield Community College, and right opposite Harper's grocery store there. And he was lying down below near the river, and a few days after the fight, people came up, found his body, took him up onto the terrace out of the wetland, and buried him on the hill there. And then apparently, 150 years later, somebody knew where the site was and took up his remains, put him in a box, and put him in a barn in Greenfield. Then the barn burned down. So that was the end of William Turner. But one of the fascinating finds was the natives who were there and survived the fight. The English tracked them down, which is what they did in Scotland and Ireland and everywhere else there was a rebellion. They tracked every single last one down and hanged them. So a lot of hangings happened on Boston Common. But there was one man who was put on trial in Newport, Rhode Island in August of 1676, and he said, I was there when Turner got shot. I saw him get shot on his horse, and I know it was him because he told me his name. So here you have an eyewitness account written down by the clerk of the court, this man saying that he saw and witnessed, the demise of William Turner. So that was just fascinating to me, to have an eyewitness account of that. And not to be too harsh on Turner, he to lead this. So he had been in a Puritan jail for 5 years in Boston because he was a Baptist. And the Puritans didn't want any Baptists around Boston, so they got him and threw him in jail. And you can imagine Puritan jail, pretty much a very medieval existence if you survived at all. And he had been there for 5 years. But he had some military experience, and so the Puritans cut a deal with him saying, we'll let you build a Baptist church in Boston if you go out and kill Indians in the valley. And so we said, all right, I guess I'll do that. But when he got his orders, to be ready to attack and fight in Hatfield and Northampton and lead this expedition, he wrote to Massachusetts Bay Colony authorities saying, I'm too old for this. I'm sick. I'm 63. Get somebody else to do this. And they said, no, nothing doing it. You're the one. So he went, pretty much like to his destiny. I mean, he was not going to survive. The story is that he did send his son home from Northampton, so the son didn't have to be part of the attack. So at least there's that. So not to say there's sympathy for Turner, but they were doing things that were done in those days, and it's hard to judge after all. But let me move on. I got a couple of maps to show you. These are going to be sort of tricky to understand, but this is the Franklin County Fairgrounds. You can see the oval shape there. This is the Deerfield River in the North Meadows of Deerfield. All these blue things are musket ball finds. So they found, like I said, by the time they were done in this area, they found close to 500. And you see that cluster. So this was kind of not known, except November and December, they came across this battle site. So natives were preventing the English from getting across the river. That was where the ford was. So all of this spot here, there was really heavy-duty fighting going on. So they found musket balls. This had been a pine forest, and so we're even in recorded memory, people had been tapping and getting pine pitch to use in Greenfield. And they found musket balls that were impacted with, still had pieces of wood on them. So pretty interesting. I'll just show you these last pictures because it's just the important thing is the blue things, the blue dots where all that stuff was found.
Where is that? The blue dots where all that's found in Greenfield.
Mm-hmm.
Where is it?
So yeah, it's Meridian Street and Colorado Avenue. Like I was showing you in one of these slides, there is the Franklin County Fairground right here. So yeah, right near Green River Cemetery. The archaeologists got permission from landowners here, and some landowners said no. They did get permission from the Green River Cemetery to metal detect, but they had to stay only on the path. But they found musket balls there too. You know, of course, they didn't go anywhere near the grave sites, but just in the path through among the graves, it was stuff was there. So all that's been there for 350 years, and they turned it up.
How deep were they finding the musket balls?
Pardon?
How deep were the musket balls?
Interestingly, a lot of the artifacts were not very deep at all. Probably, unless there had been some construction on the site, that would have created fill. Most of them were about within a foot and a half to 2 feet. After all that time, most articles artifacts like that are in fairly close to the surface. If you were to look at a typical profile of the soil, you've got what they call the plow zone, which is probably a foot and a half, maybe. Then you've got that's called the A horizon. Then you've got the next level, which is the B horizon. By the time you get to the C, it's sterile. There's nothing down there, But in the valley, you have those segmented areas. Most of the artifacts are in that A zone, So interestingly, that stuff would not be very deep. Basically, what they did, they heard the Geiger counter tell them there's something there. They took a trowel and dug a little flower pot size hole, located the musket ball, GPS'd it, put it in a bag, padded, and all said, and you could not tell there had been anything there ever. So a lot of those musket balls are in a collection now at University of Connecticut, and once we have a resource center in Montague somewhere, we will get that back and have a place for it. I kind of close on this. I've been talking for a long time, and I really appreciate your patience, and there's so much to tell. King Philip's War, 1675-76, and I call this the postscript because look at everything that happened for the next 100 years or so. King William's War came along till 1697, then Queen Anne's War, which is when the Deerfield raid occurred. Then Greylock's War, 1720 to 1745, raids on Northfield, and Dummer's War. Greylock was a Pocumtuck descendant from Westfield, and was all up and down the valley and way up into Canada and back, and he was never caught. He managed a long, 25 years of attacks and surprise attacks, and he just went off into the sunset without ever being captured. King George's War, French and Indian War, Treaty of Paris, finally. In the French were defeated in 1759 at the Battle of Quebec. One of my ancestors was there. Karen's ancestor was there. We both regret that loss. The French lost the Battle of Quebec. But there was a Treaty of Paris, 1763, which was a great relief to everybody in the valley because that meant the end of all the Indian raids. No more Indian raids. There had been continual raids through the 1740s. You can see these wars here. But finally, once the French were defeated, then that brought everything to a close, except when the French left, the English didn't quite know how to handle the vacuum. The French had been very good diplomats and in, let's say, respecting native customs of gift giving and sitting in circles and smoking tobacco for hours and hours and listening to long, long speeches like this one. And the English said, I don't have any time for that. And they didn't offer gifts, they didn't maintain the peace. And so in the Ohio River Valley, a coalition of natives under Pontiac, they began a war. They rose up right after the Treaty of Paris, and that lasted until 1765, fought the English to a standstill. Lord Jeffrey Amherst had to go home to England in shame. I think he managed to be named a lord once he was back there, but he had been the supreme commander of all the British forces in North America, and he couldn't beat Pontiac. So that was the end of that. And look how close it is to the American Revolution, because the English were not able to defeat Pontiac's coalition. Nevertheless, they knew they had to do something, and so they enforced a law down the Appalachians saying the American colonists, could not cross the Appalachians and start settling further west. That was forbidden. And the Americans said, yeah, right, I'm going to stay here, stuck on the coast like this. And so there was a lot of intrusions and crossing in. And then the English were getting madder and madder, and they made the coastal people, especially in Boston and elsewhere, made them put up the English redcoats. So that was another really, very irksome to the colonists. So Pontiac's War in some ways led to the conditions that launched the American Revolution, because of all the impositions and rules and laws posed on the colonists. So anyway, this was, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't wear out my welcome, but it's just, you can see, I've been very excited about learning about this, and it's, something that happened just in our neighborhood. So this was, I'm sure that this is being filmed. This is a set of sources I used, and if you haven't read this little book by George Sheldon, it's a great book to keep your, it's a doorstopper for sure. This is volume 1 of 2 volumes, about 800 pages worth of history of this valley. But Sheldon, to his credit, did a lot of that research and talked, I like to picture him, he lived to be about 100. Born in 1818, and he died around just around 1917 or so. He didn't live to be 100, but he was close, 99. But anyway, he was a born historian, so he was talking to the elders in the village who had stories from their great-grandparents. So he wrote down, the book is loaded with stories and details. About Hatfield, too. You can find out stuff here, you can find out population, you can find out where the Palisade stockade was, where the fight happened down Main Street, and all kinds of people who lived here before, and where the Indians had attacked and what they did here in town. So anyway, I better stop and take a breath, but be glad to handle any questions if you want. I got some water. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So While David is drinking a very well-deserved drink of water, I'd just like to say that George Shelton's History of Deerfield is available on the Internet Archive. So if you just Google George Shelton History of Deerfield, you will be able to read a lot of it online if you want. So that's very cool for those of us who make use of that. There's snacks back there. There's bathrooms right there. David has offered to stay even longer and answer questions if there are any questions, but I'm going to give people a minute to move around. Thank you so much.